we'll begin. So my name is معاذ Mosbahi, for the people who are here who don't know. I worked as an associate curator on the contemporary commissions for the biennial, and I work as an independent curator currently based at Princeton in the United States. I'm super happy to be here in conversation with ورند, who's someone and whose work I've come across for some time, and in actually many other places before we kind of also came here with the Islamic Art Biennial. We're going to have a very light conversation and also think through some of the things that are happening in the world at the moment that is less light. And I think we're going to try and think through both the work that's behind you, so we're situated right next to the installation and her contribution to this exhibition. And we're going to go through some of the background and histories of the project and how it came to be. So Rund's practice examines the traces left behind by people and the spaces that they inhabit and the spaces they move between and from and away and towards. She explores the similarities and juxtapositions between these kind of different temporalities, diasporic and alternative realities, and how things emerge in re-adjacencies and kind of refashioned moments of convergence. She questions, in a sense, and this is the kind of main topic of our conversation today, our personal archives, their value, their richness, but also in many instances, their fragility and their precarity, and the risks that they face. And we kind of are going to highlight the kind of personal documentations and the rippling effects on our own micro-histories and larger narratives. She's currently based in Germany, in Frankfurt, and used to live in Jeddah for some time. And I suppose one of the things, before we really open it up to talk about the conversation, is to take check of also what's occurring at the moment, which this work is so deeply entwined with. So our first conversation with ورند actually occurred, we've been in conversation for a few years, but for the biennial it occurred over a year ago now, I believe, in a moment that was kind of quite different. And so much has happened in the last month or so, in the last weeks, that have placed the project in a different effect. And so I kind of pass it over to ورند to also maybe speak about this and start us in our conversation.
Thank you for the intro. My name is ورند. Grateful to have you here. And I'll start talking about as you said, the different cycles that we've been through in this work and in history. I grew up between two Niles, and it had such a great effect on me as a person, as an artist, and it kept me in a fluid state when it comes to making work and perceiving things. Most of the images that I'm going to show today were taken by my father, including this archival image. In Sudan, we have a long history of migration, a history that spans through our music, our songs, our poetry, and our literature itself. And it brings me to think about a very famous novel by Tayyib Saleh called Season of Migration to the North. And the thing about this novel is that it is in itself is very fluid and takes such a very amorphous form of historical and fictional reality. And even the way that the novel ends, it ends with the protagonist walking into the Nile after migrating from Sudan to the UK and coming back to Sudan at the end. And I started this project as I moved from Khartoum to Jeddah to start living with my father again, since he was working here for a couple of years, plus 20 years. And it was difficult to adjust, I have to be honest. And I came across a set of images that I haven't looked into for a while. And I started to see different things in them and sit with them. And I'm not sure if it was escapism or it was boredom.
But maybe, I mean, it would be interesting to hear, so you talk about, in a sense, growing up in Sudan, in Khartoum, and this relationship to literature, to references, right, to the history of this place. And then that was kind of before you moved to Jeddah. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the relationship to photographs and images while you were growing up in Khartoum, and then, like, we understand, I suppose, as you say now, like this relationship to it in Jeddah. So was it, let's say, your family home a place of many picture frames? Was, like, let's say, people's stories narrated through photographs? What was the ways in which the visual kind of register of history present as a child growing up? What was the,
As a child growing up, I think a lot of the visual materials that we received was through mail and envelopes. I think the way that we had updates about each other with family and friends was through having printed photographs that were sent along with letters, just to keep up with people and how they're doing at the moment and what shape and form.
But so printed photographs in terms of like people's trips, and they would send it back, or was it like pictures of birthdays? Like, what was the nature of the images that you were receiving?
Yeah, as I said, because the history of migration in Sudan is so long and spacious, so we have so many families scattered around the globe. And the way that we would keep in touch was through these photographs and letters. And in the back of the photos, we would also have the names of every person and the dates as well. So I was looking for these. I also scanned the back of these images when I worked on the project, because sometimes they would have like a small phrase to tie things together. And as you said, having the context of these images in Sudan is so different from Jeddah, because I got used to the sight of what's in the frames by being in the present. And I think the separation and moving away from that had hidden some views out of my sight, but also introduced me to new sights.
Was, I'm sorry if I'm asking kind of very specific questions, but I'm really intrigued because in a sense it feels, and this is part of, I suppose, what I find really beautiful in your work, is that it's something that feels so familiar, but it's something so specific, right? It's like something that we do so individually as a family, as a kind of growing up, and yet something that I can really relate to. And I was wondering, like in this case, when you receive pictures, was it your mom, was it your dad? Who was the one who would always be kind of taking care of them, like preserving them? Like in my case, it was like, you know, my mom was someone who was kind of quite obsessed with certain photographs, and so it would always be kind of like hidden away in her cupboards, like they weren't really on display that often because of the fact that so many were lost. So that fear of the lost image becomes like something that means that I don't see them every day and I have to kind of make an occasion to like access them. And I was wondering, in your case, like who is the member of the family who would, be the custodian?
I think it started with my grandfather, and he's the person that you can see in this footage. He always had this 18mm film camera around him as he traveled to different places in Sudan and also outside of Sudan. And I think he started that kind of relationship with documentation, and he also I managed to know a lot about him through this documentation that unfortunately got lost after he passed. And as you said, the deciding factor in every personal history sometimes solely depends on one person who decides to
Takes charge, yeah.
have it as his priority to keep it together.
And so the 18mm was a film reel or was a still photograph?
Film reel.
Film reel. And so in a sense, what was that relationship between, let's say, watching videos and having then still photographs? Was it, let's say, what remained was more still photographs, but more videos were taken and lost? What was the kind of, or was it more just this one grandfather who happened to have a video camera?
It was my grandfather, but it was my father as well. He had a film camera that he took it with him as they migrated through the world, but also when they went out in Sudan as well. And he had this funny relationship with these photographs because he used to work as a doctor, but in one of the projects that he had, he wanted to replace the photographs on the billboards, in the ads on the billboards in Sudan, because they were all like smoking ads, and he wanted to change that. So he took a trip in the streets of Khartoum and started taking photographs, which became an accidental archive of street photography in Sudan in the 80s.
So he took these photographs with a desire to place them on the billboards, or it was kind of to show?
He wanted to replace them with different ads for different products, and that was just a site visit for him to show it back to the group, the Association of Anti-Smoking. And I came across it years later, and we included it in an archival exhibition in Local.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, that is called This Will Have Been, Archives of the Past, Present and the Future.
And Local is a collective based in Khartoum or Sudan more broadly?
It's also based across
the world. But
the world. Yeah.
There are 4 of you, and I think you're one of the 4. And it's interesting to think through, I suppose, the ways in which one shows and exhibits, right, like personal memories and stories. And I wonder if you can speak a bit about like why it was important to collect through, let's say, the collective of Local, and what kinds of, like in terms of showing that work in the context of Sudan, what kinds of images or like responses, or how did people kind of engage with it?
It was very tricky to work with the archive since it's such a contingent matter, and we were very aware of the people, of the socioeconomic factors that led to the formation of this archive and different archives, and the people that tend to fall out of the frame because they did not have access to photography studios, for example, in some parts of Sudan. So working with the archive has always been tricky because we also did not want to participate in the process of weaponization of nostalgia to fit the national narrative that is very exclusionary. So it was a challenge to work with what we have, because some of the archive is colonial, some of the archive presents one lens of the state, some of the archive is complicated to explain, and also the reception of it as nostalgic elements is something that I really try to shy away from.
I mean, it's really tough insofar as one thinks through, when we're talking in this specific archive, it's a personal archive, and so when one looks obviously at the family photographs, there is so much meaning that's silent, right? It's like there's so much that we know what this narrative was, we recognize maybe figures, and the moment then you take this material and you put it, and you decontextualize it, you take it out of the family home, you take it out of, let's say, the individual members that know the people so well or have a kind of relationship to it that's not about being an audience, creates something that's quite charged, but also does something that opens up certain avenues. And I wonder if maybe we can think through and I like that movement. So we talked about, let's say, some of the work that happened in Khartoum and what that meant and what are the kinds of things that you were engaging with and showing some of this work publicly to that specific audience. And I was wondering if you can talk a bit, maybe now in this movement to Jeddah, and what kind of happened, I suppose, across the Red Sea.
So the movement of
yourself
myself
with your archive,
yeah.
As you kind of practice more as an artist here, right? Like this also where a space you developed your methods and your techniques and some of your art making kind of considerations.
I think Jeddah is an interesting place to work from because it overlooks Port Sudan, and the Red Sea stands in the way, but is also a way into both cities back and forth. And there were places that I used to go to in Jeddah whenever I felt homesick, and by the manipulation of the frame, I used to trick myself into seeing it as it's in Khartoum. And I have what I noticed as a pattern in my work, a lot of spaces that exist in the frames that have been withdrawn from reality in a physical or non-physical way. And thinking about the images that I either took in Bab Sharif or the images I had with me, the archive that my parents carried with them to Jeddah, it posed a lot of questions about context and about this separation of context and the thing that is activated once you separate the context from the image itself. And I thought of it as a way to instigate fictional realms and a way to see outside of what reality can give you. And that's what I tried to work through with these images without manipulating them, but in a sense, when I combine different parts of history, space and time together, where that could lead us, and what does that mean for our desires and our hopes, in a way.
And I think, I mean, the question of context is really powerful, and I think there's something, I mean, in one way, the photograph as a medium itself is always out of context, right? It's like you've taken a picture, it becomes something flat, and it travels, right? And so that question of then the moments in which you're taking the photographs of aswaq, of markets in Jeddah, in which what appears visually as maybe in Khartoum versus what is in Jeddah becomes a question of framing, right? So it's, you're like, okay, if I just remove this much of the building, it could be somewhere else, right? So there's something that's really powerful about the context of the frame, of like what kind of is within and what's without. And then there's the question of the context of the photograph. So we have, let's say, the physical space that you're trying to think through and engage with. And then there's the ways in which the photograph itself begins to have, occupies a space, takes up a kind of value, that then in the arrangement of multiple photographs, you create this kind of new context, right? And I find that really powerful, because there's kind of two meanings to the word context there. It's like both the physical geographic space in which you're working in, that one associates with a certain thing, and then actually it's the very material, tangible nature of the photograph or the postcard or the found kind of visual object, and what it means to start arranging them, working with them. And I find, if you could speak a bit more around the kind of spaces you create in the image, and that collage would be.
Yeah. As I said earlier, I thought a lot about bodies of water in the work, because there are certain spaces in these photographs that carry either the Nile or the Red Sea or some oceans. That is something that I've been contemplating a lot, and it's something that whenever I went to the Red Sea, I would stare and I would try to imagine that the port stands still by the other side. But at the same time, I wanted to push myself further into other fictional spaces that go beyond any realistic time and place. And I think it was difficult at times because of my relationship with the subjects in the image to separate myself from the context, but it's also funny to try to think as a stranger what those subjects could mean to others, and also the idea that interpretation is in the hand of the viewer, which also gives kind of a freeing sense of where the work could go. And I think I tried as best as I can to forget the location of every photo, just to try to see the spatial relationship between images. Where more could it go? Sometimes the boundaries are connected with a form of a line, and sometimes it's in the subject itself.
No, and I think, there's something really powerful insofar as these still images, in the ways in which you bring them together, become a kind of still moving image, right? Insofar as there's an idea of the moving image, the still image, and in that coupling together, there's something that becomes very animate, very dynamic. In this example, for example, you almost listen to the dialogue between these two people, right? The image becomes loud. You begin to be attuned to what is happening here, what is going on between them, what is that space. That isn't simply a question of adjacency and like a material space, but also one where you start reading into what happened before, what happened after, what could be possible in the encounter, right? So it's like when two people come together, it's like you would never engage with a moment of silence. There's something there that's audible. And in these moments, you really try and listen to the image in some ways. And I find that really powerful. And I find that also in the ways in which you quite playfully evoke, let's say, certain kinds of continuity between, like as you said, the lines versus other aspects. And I wonder, when you're judging these, it's like, what are the ways in which, in your arrangements, you, like how many times do you kind of shift them around? Like how far back do you have to stand to be like, okay, this works, this doesn't work? Is there more hidden and coded messages between the coupling that only you know or only people who know the people know? If you can tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah. I think there are two elements that played a big role in the making of these photo compositions, and one of them is duration, and I think duration is one of the biggest elements in the making of a work, because the more I sat with an image, or the more one sits with an object, the more they start to implement some of their subconscious, some of their thoughts and feelings into it. So I depended a lot on this duration to continue, and at the same time on another element that is repetition. So by repetition, I just kept trying to forge this world that does not make sense by one attempt or two, but it has to repeat itself with time. And it's something that I see a lot in Ibrahim Shaddad's work. He's a Sudanese filmmaker that has a film called Jamal that follows the daily routine of a camel that works in a sesame mill. And what's something that interests me about his work is that there are these shots, as you said, in the moving image, where he suddenly places an image of a camel wearing some sort of garment. And in the first time it catches you, there's an absurdity in that, and it also feels funny. But with every frame, you start to believe in the fact that these camels are what they are in reality. And I think repetition is one of the most powerful forms in art, in where we can exit whatever reality we're in and delve into more of a fictional logic. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's interesting because, let's say in a film, the question of like montage or sequence becomes the main driver of a certain story, of a certain narrative. In a still image, it's obviously, there's a different kind of work to understand, okay, what's going on, what is the story behind this, how did it arrive here? And one of the things that I find really interesting is you're attending to also the image as a material photograph or a postcard, right? And so there's a kind of really interesting moment in which actually it contains not only the stories, but also contains a set of constraints, right? And this is something that I think we dealt with in the context of this exhibition, which we're sitting under, has an incredibly difficult and inconvenient, to be honest, scale to work with. So we're like, okay, we want to have these images outside, we want to deal with their sensitivity, really want to kind of tend to them as precious objects, and yet we're in this vast space in which things get lost. And I think it was really kind of interesting the ways in which you really hold to the paper it's printed on, how large it can go without it being degraded. And maybe you can just speak a bit about this process in which you found some of these in the work that you have, which are postcards, sorry. And then, you know, that meant that a postcard is 5 by 7 inches, and that meant that it could only go up to a certain size. Yeah, it would be nice to hear about that and how that kind of controlled some of what we see behind us.
It was very challenging because I was confronted by how bad at math I am, and as much as I work with space, how bad I am in envisioning a space for the work, especially because I wasn't able to come for a site visit. And I remember after arriving on the installation day and looking at these tents and thinking, wow, I think I messed up with the numbers. But after spending some time with the photographs, I think this scale is interesting in the way that if you stand from Lee Najlan's work, for example,
which is the one with the holes in the curved wall.
Yeah, you start to see it as photographs, as print photographs from that perspective, and that's why I also insisted on keeping the corners curved as they are in the print photographs, just to keep the feel of the image as it is. And the more that you get closer to them, the more you start to see some of the details on the photo. And what was also interesting to me is that once I changed the scale of the work, in which it was actual physical photographs, suddenly it became a totally different artwork than the one that I am familiar with. And that took a lot of time to also process. and I started to also get more details from the image as it is. Like one of the images, the first one here, after I worked with it on a bigger scale, I realized that my father was actually smiling in the photo, which I didn't catch in the first time, which also changed a lot of things about the work for me. And it was also difficult to try to figure out how much can I go without it going into a totally different conceptual form.
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, it was again that moment of confronting its material condition, and so that the relationship to size and seeing things with a slightly different eye, thinking of distance and perspective, became really crucial, and I suppose a sign of also like re-seeing, like re-engaging with the work, as you said. I think there's also something where we really actually imagine the collage as a analog collage. Right, and so this kind of brings into like history actually of sculpture, in which the sculpture is always made from a particular perspective, even though it's in the round, it's three-dimensional, but typically it's always conceived of as being seen from one place. And so here actually there's exactly that tradition in one way being carried out, that these collages kind of ask you to stand in one place, but also invite you and allow you to look at them from the side, to see it complete, that the digital kind of rendition that we see on the screen doesn't allow. And I suppose there's something interesting in that tension, and more than interesting, I suppose there's something that in that tension allows for the audience to engage with these narratives that you're collaging together, right? And I wonder how much of letting that go was important. Insofar as it points to also you as an artist versus you as someone who is intimately and emotionally tied to these images, right? It's about some kind of letting go.
It was, it took me a lot of time to think, as you said, about my relationship to the objects and the way that I would expose them to a whole audience without this context that I know of these images. And I think I was reading a lot into Sadiya Hartman's work, which is about the speculation of archival imagery that depicts black subjects throughout history. And I was also thinking about Tina Kamp's words in listening to images, and thinking about how much of what we see is really true, and how much of any alteration that I'm gonna make with these photographs, which direction would it lead, and if I am okay for them to be perceived in a certain way. And I don't know if I said this before or not, but there's a big difference between the historical selves, our historical selves, and our artist selves.
It would be nice to hear more about this, because we haven't
yeah. And for example, the work has gone through different cycles since we started working on it together, and since I started working on it, which was in 2017. And in that time, we had recently moved to Jeddah, and I was trying to make sense of the space that I was in, and without having my own space as I used to, and trying to see more into these images. And that was a different context than when we started working with these images last year, which then my family had migrated from Jeddah back to Khartoum, which was a totally different context as well that I was seeing these images with. And And then now, as we're closing in on the Biennale, I'm also thinking about the way that my family became displaced because of the events that are taking place in Sudan, which makes me see these works in a totally different light and a totally different story than the fictional narrative that I was working with. And that's where it comes what I think the historical self and the artist selves are separated in a way. And there's always a certain negotiation of when to bring which self in how many inches as much as possible.
Yeah, and I really kind of, like firstly just like to say with that, really acknowledge the ways in which I suppose this question of being somewhere, right, of where one is in any one time, it's something that you've really beautifully and really generously kind of shared in public through your practice, right? It's like something that I think we all struggle with privately, and actually through your practice, you open that up in a way that's really vulnerable. And I just really kind of acknowledge that, and I'm really kind of grateful for that, for me and to think with. And I think there's something that's, I suppose, really powerful insofar as that in my own history of growing up in Libya and then having to move, in the ways in which these images become a certain kind of home, a certain kind of homeliness, right? They belong somewhere, and we belong with them somewhere. And that coupling becomes not only, let's say, a reality we hold on to, but also in itself becomes a site of its own fragility, right? Insofar as these photographs that we hold on to are themselves at risk, right? So not only do they point to a place that we maybe no longer can go back to, or a place that's really difficult to go back to, a place that's at risk, but they themselves become kind of a new site in which we kind of worry about, we care for, we try and tend, and we try and preserve. And that, I think, is really difficult, but it's also one where when you collage them and you bring them together, it also, I suppose, like, opens that up, right? It gives a certain agency to be like, you know what, I can make my home here. I can try and make a space, actually, where I can feel a sense of belonging, because I'm also kind of creating my fate, right, in some way. And I think that's something that's both, like, moving beyond nostalgia, like very much like a place of caring for a place, but also actually of holding on to one's own ability to make that happen. And so I kind of, I'd love to hear more about the nature of the photographs. I know the ones in this space had early conversations of trying to find the originals, to scan them, and that was a whole kind of wild goose chase across 3 continents. But I wonder if you can speak about that, and also give us a bit of kind of sense of what's happening with the photographs now.
Yeah. Okay, just to give you a bit of context, when I was making these works, I used to live with my family in Jeddah, and after that, there came a point where we were both going our separate ways. I was going to move to Frankfurt to study in an art school there, and they were going to move to Khartoum. And there became the question of the images. Where should the images go? And if our priority is to save them, which it was our priority is to keep them intact, then which place would be safer for that? And I made the decision of taking them back to, of letting my family take them back to Sudan, to Khartoum, because that's the main house that we live in, and it is the root, and there is enough space for that, for the photographs to be, where me in Frankfurt, I didn't even know what my situation is going to be like, if I'm going to keep moving. And these images are from the 70s, some are from the 60s, some are from the 80s. So they're in a fragile state where I don't want to move them and tear them apart in any way. So I chose to keep them with my family in Sudan. And then when Moad reached out for the work to be included as part of the Islamic art biennial, I was kind of I was in a dilemma because I didn't have the photographs with me. I had scans of them that I made with our home printer, and then we had to quickly think on our feet on how to get the original, the high resolution scans of the images, how to source the images themselves in Sudan, how to get the images to Germany, or should we get them to Jeddah, and then where we see where we can go from there. It was a whole process, and I'm so thankful for my mother because they had recently moved to Khartoum, and they had a shipping container where some of the suitcases were that had the images, and she had to go through a whole journey because she didn't even know where she kept them. And then we had a whole correspondence through WhatsApp video calls for hours of me showing her the image on my laptop and her trying to piece it together through the random arrangements of photographs. And that's when I discovered that we really don't have a system. Like every 3 photos are in some corner or in some suitcase, and she had to go through our whole family's history to see where we stand.
I mean, I think this is something that I personally really relate to, and I think so many people do, where it's like to retrieve one item, you need to engage with the whole collection because it's always the very last page or it's the very last one that you find. And there's something about that, I think, that's actually really beautiful, but also really frustrating in so many aspects. And that's where the question of like the personal in the personal archive is also not only a question of like where it exists, but also how it's filed, how it's maintained, how it's kept. But it's, yeah, I mean, I don't know in terms of like the other side of this, which is like these hours of conversations with your mom around like as a kind of artistic research method, right? Where it's like you also begin to discover things that you don't know on the way, which I think is really beautiful.
My mom, bless her, she gets easily distracted. So the photo on the right was some sort of photo from our family trip somewhere, and then she just started talking about whatever that happened in that point of time. And at some point she started collaging herself. She was like, hey, how about this composition? That would work. Or, hey, look at me. Like it's Islamic art. Look at these 2 domes together. Like I can be an artist too. And I told her, like, you are an artist. And she writes as well. And it's funny that she also took the method. I started seeing a pattern in her collages that was mimicking the pattern that I had in my photos. And I wish I had a record of these conversations because it was very interesting. As you said, it's a different form of research and a different form of delving into this history, because I have thankfully some of the subjects in the photos are with me, and I can always point out to, oh, where was this taken, or what was going on in this photo or that. And what I wanted also to say that the screenshot of the photo on the right is our living room, and that's something that's very interesting about personal records, is that it accidentally becomes about the national and the greater scale of history, as in when spaces are lost, when homes no longer exist, we would accidentally have a footage of these places. And what I think is that they are as much as part of the historical narrative as the photos of whatever presidential event that took place throughout history.
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, this is the thing where it's like this accumulation of material. So like the photographs, then the screenshot of the photographs, and how that begins to really kind of speak to a certain kind of narrative. We're coming up to time, and I suppose want to leave the last few minutes for you around maybe bringing us back to today, thinking about, I suppose, what are the ways in which one's practice also begins to mean and have different qualities as it's as like different moments in history begin to change and shape. And I think, yeah, like maybe just finish with a few more words.
I think the relationship of the artist and their work is never endless, and it does not finish when the work is completed. I think it's the other way around of it taking different lives throughout time and throughout the growth of the artists themselves and their interpretation. And I think these images are a good example of that, because there are still places of mystery in which I don't even have an answer to this work about, and that's something that I cherish a lot in my practice and in my thinking, which is just the fluidity of thought and the fluidity of whatever that could mean, and the places that we believe in to be very real could become fictional because of different elements, whether it's our thinking or historical moments as well.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a beautiful way to end. I think the ways in which you both have to let go to be able to take up something, the ways in which you kind of rearrange to be able to not only live with, but also make living more possible in some ways. And I think these things are really, really resonate with me. I've learned so much in these kind of conversations, and I look forward to having more of that. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us here.
Thank you everyone. Yeah.